The chains felt cold against John Morrison's wrists as he stood in the center of the Galactic Council chamber, a massive dome of crystal and steel that housed representatives from 47 different species across the known galaxy. And above him, the High Arbiter Zundra sat on an elevated platform. Her 6 arms folded in what John had learned was a gesture of finality among her people. The chamber buzzed with alien voices, some speaking in clicks and whistles, others in deep rumbles that made his chest vibrate. But the translation device in his ear converted it all into English. A cacophony of judgment and condemnation directed at him. Ambassador Lisa Martinez stood beside him, her face tight with controlled anger, and she had fought for 3 days straight to prevent this moment. But the council had made its decision. John Morrison of Earth. Zundra's voice echoed through the chamber, translated perfectly by the neural implants all council members wore. You have been found guilty of desecrating a sacred Krellian ceremony and assaulting a child during their coming-of-age ritual. And the sentence is death by molecular disintegration, to be carried out in 7 standard days. John felt Lisa's hand briefly touch his shoulder, a gesture of support that protocol barely allowed. And he kept his face calm even as his heart hammered in his chest. The memory of that day 6 months ago played in his mind, like a recording he couldn't shut off. And he had been on the Krellian homeworld as part of a cultural exchange program, walking through what he thought was a public market, when he heard screaming. A small Krellian child, no bigger than a human 6-year-old, had been surrounded by adults wearing ceremonial masks, and they held glowing brands that they pressed against the child's scaled skin, leaving marks that smoked and sizzled. While the child shrieked in what John's human brain interpreted as pure terror and pain, he hadn't thought, just acted, the way his father had taught him, the way any decent person would when they saw a child being hurt. And he had rushed forward, shoving the adults aside with strength that surprised them, their lighter gravity world making them unprepared for Earth's higher gravity-borne power. He had scooped up the child and run. And only when Krellian security forces had surrounded him did he realize his terrible mistake. It wasn't abuse. They had told him coldly it was the marking ceremony, a sacred tradition where a child proved their courage by enduring ritual burns that would scar them for life as proof of their transition to adulthood. And every Krellian underwent it, had undergone it for 10,000 years. John had tried to explain, had apologized profusely, but the damage was done. And the Krellian Empire was one of the most powerful members of the Galactic Council, their military vast and their resources immense. While Earth was barely 6 months into its probationary membership, Counselor Vextar, the Krellian representative, rose from his seat now, his reptilian face twisted in what John had learned was righteous anger. And he spoke in a hissing voice that the translators rendered cold and precise. The human claims ignorance. But ignorance is no excuse for such violation, Vextar said, his clawed hand pointing at John like a weapon. He assaulted our priests. He stole a child in the midst of their most sacred moment. And he showed contempt for traditions that predate his entire species' civilization. Lisa Martinez stepped forward, her voice steady despite the impossible odds. The Galactic Council is supposed to be a place of understanding and cooperation. And John Morrison acted on instinct to protect what he perceived as a child in danger. And that instinct, that immediate response to shield the innocent, is fundamental to human nature. Then human nature is incompatible with civilized society, Vextar shot back. And several counselors murmured agreement. John wanted to speak, to defend himself. But Lisa had warned him that any words from him would only make things worse. And the council didn't want to hear from him. They wanted to make an example. Zundra raised one hand for silence, and the chamber quieted instantly. Ambassador Martinez, Earth's cultural differences have been noted in our records, but membership in the Galactic Council requires respect for all member species' traditions. no matter how they may appear to newcomers. Even traditions that harm children, Lisa said quietly. And John felt a flash of pride at her courage, even as he knew it was futile. The Krellian coming-of-age ceremony has been practiced for millennia without council interference, Zandra replied. And we cannot create exceptions based on one species' emotional reactions, or the entire framework of mutual respect collapses. Kevin Bradley, Earth's government liaison, stood in the observation gallery above, watching with clenched fists. And John could see the man's face red with frustration, but there was nothing he could do. Nothing any of them could do. Does the condemned have any final statement before we conclude these proceedings? Zandra asked. Following protocol, Lisa looked at John, her eyes silently begging him to stay quiet, to not make things worse. But John had never been good at staying quiet when something needed to be said. I would do it again, he said clearly, his voice carrying through the chamber. If I saw a child suffering, any child of any species, I would act to help them. And if that makes me guilty, then I accept that guilt. The chamber erupted in noise, some species shouting in approval, others in outrage. And Vextar's face contorted with fury. You see, the Krellian ambassador hissed. He admits his crime and promises to repeat it, and this is the arrogance of humanity, thinking their morality supersedes galactic law. Zondra's hand came down hard on her platform, making a sound like thunder that silenced everyone. The sentence stands, and John Morrison will be transferred to a holding facility until the execution. And this session is concluded. Guards move forward. Not human guards, but Zentari warriors with their forearms and crystalline armor. And they took John by the arms with surprising gentleness as they led him away. John looked back at Lisa Martinez, seeing tears in her eyes that she tried to hide. And he gave her a small smile, trying to tell her without words that he didn't regret his choice. Kevin Bradley was already on his communicator, no doubt sending word back to Earth. And John wondered how his family would take the news, how his brother Daniel would react when he learned that John had been sentenced to death for trying to save a child. The corridor outside the council chamber was long and curved, following the ring structure of Zenith Prime Station. And through the transparent walls, John could see the stars, infinite and cold and beautiful. I am sorry, one of the Zenari guards said quietly in surprisingly good English. I have children, and I understand why you acted. John looked at the alien warrior, seeing something like compassion in those multifaceted eyes. Thank you. It will not change anything, the guard continued. But I wanted you to know that not everyone in the galaxy agrees with this judgment. They walked the rest of the way in silence. And John thought about his brother Daniel, about his parents who had died years ago, but who had taught him to always protect those who couldn't protect themselves. And he thought about the Krellian child whose name he had never learned, wondering if that child understood why a strange alien had tried to rescue them from their own culture's traditions. The holding facility was clean and surprisingly comfortable, with a bed and a viewport showing the stars. And the guards removed his chains. Before leaving him alone, John sat on the bed and looked out at the vast darkness of space. And he thought about Earth, about the blue marble that had given birth to humanity. And he wondered if his death would be the end of Earth's hopes for a place in the galactic community. 7 days. He had 7 days to live, and he found himself thinking not about his own death, but about what came after. About whether humanity would bow to the Council's judgment or whether they would fight. He hoped they would be smart. Hoped they would swallow their pride and maintain the peace, even if it meant sacrificing him. Because Earth needed the Council more than the Council needed Earth. But deep down, in the part of him that was purely human, that came from a species that had climbed its way up from the caves and conquered its own world through sheer stubborn will. He hoped they would fight not for him but for the principle, for the idea that some things mattered more than politics and power. And that protecting children was one of those things. The stars offered no answers. Just their cold and ancient light, and John Morrison settled in to wait for whatever came next. The news hit Earth like a shockwave, spreading from government channels to social media in minutes, and within an hour. Protests had erupted in every major city on the planet. President Amanda Price sat in the Situation Room deep beneath the White House, surrounded by her cabinet and military advisors. And she had barely slept since Kevin Bradley's message arrived from Zenith Prime. "They can't be serious," General Christopher Lane said, slamming his fist on the table, executing a man for trying to save a child. "And they expect us to just accept it." The council made its position clear, Dr. Susan Kane replied, the xenanthropologist's voice tired from hours of briefing. "They see this as a test of our commitment to galactic law, and if we intervene, they'll revoke our membership. Then, maybe we don't need their membership." Lane shot back. President Price held up a hand for silence, and the room quieted immediately. "General, I understand your frustration. But we're talking about one man versus the entire future of humanity's place in the galaxy. One man who was doing the right thing," Lane said quietly. "I know," Price said, and her voice carried the weight of impossible choices. "Believe me, I know." Michelle Davis, the Public Information Director, cleared her throat nervously. "Madam President, the public response has been overwhelming, and we've had over 50 million messages demanding action. And there are protests outside every alien embassy on the planet. How are the other species representatives responding?" Price asked. "Most are staying silent," Davis replied. But the Zentari ambassador expressed private sympathy. "Off the record, of course." Dr. Kane leaned forward, her tablet glowing with research data. "Madam President, I've been going through everything we have on Krellian culture, and I found something significant." "Go on," Price said. "The marking ceremony that John interrupted isn't universal among Krellians," Kane explained. "There's a reformist faction that banned the practice in their territories almost 30 years ago, and they consider it barbaric and outdated." The room went silent as everyone processed this information, and General Lane spoke first. "So the practice John tried to stop is actually illegal in parts of the Krellian Empire itself." "Exactly," Kane confirmed. "And Councillor Vextar represents the traditionalist faction, the conservatives who want to maintain the old ways." "Can we use this?" Price asked. "I'm not sure," Kane admitted. "The council tends to avoid interfering in internal cultural matters. But it does show that John's reaction wasn't as unreasonable as Vextar claims." Kevin Bradley's image appeared on the main screen, transmitted from Zenith Prime with a slight delay. "Madam President, I've just met with Ambassador Martinez, and she says John is holding up well, but time is running out." "How long do we have?" Price asked. 5 days, Bradley said. "The execution is scheduled for noon Council Standard Time on the 5th day. What are options?" Price asked. The room. General Lane pulled up a tactical display. "We have the EDF Defiant within 3 days' travel of Zenith Prime, officially on a training mission, and Captain Gregory Walsh is one of our best. And he could theoretically mount a rescue operation." "Theoretically," Price repeated. "It would be a violation of council space," Lane admitted, "and would likely trigger a diplomatic incident at minimum. Possibly military response." "War," Price said flatly. "Possibly." Lane confirmed. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken thoughts, and everyone in the room knew what they were weighing. One life against potentially billions. A junior aide entered the room nervously. "Madam President, there's someone here demanding to see you, and security says he won't leave." "Who?" Price asked, annoyed at the interruption. "Daniel Carter," the aide said. "John Morrison's brother." Price exchanged glances with Lane, then nodded. "Send him in." Daniel Carter looked like his brother. The same strong jaw and steady eyes, but where John had chosen diplomacy, Daniel had spent 10 years in the Marines before becoming an engineer, and he stood before the most powerful people on Earth with no sign of intimidation. "Mr. Carter," Price began, "I'm sorry about your brother." "Don't be sorry," Daniel said sharply. "Do something." "We're exploring every option," Price said. "Not good enough," Daniel replied. "I've been talking to people, veterans, pilots, engineers, and we've got 70 volunteers ready to go get him." "That's admirable, but suicide," General Lane said. "Zenith Prime has defenses that would shred any civilian ship. Then give us a military ship." Daniel shot back. "I can't authorize an act of war based on family loyalty," Price said, though her voice was gentler than her words. "It's not about family," Daniel said, and his voice carried a conviction that made everyone listen. "It's about what's right. And you all know John did the right thing. And if we abandon him now, what does that say about us as a species?" "It says we're smart enough to pick our battles," Lane said. "It says we're cowards who'll sacrifice our own to avoid conflict," Daniel countered. Price stood, walking to the window that showed a live feed of protesters outside. "Mr. Carter, I have to think about 3 billion people, not just one man. That one man represents everything we claim to believe in," Daniel said. "Courage, compassion, protecting the innocent. And if we let him die for that, then we don't deserve a place in the galaxy." The room fell silent again, and Price turned back to face Daniel. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Let me take volunteers and go," Daniel said simply. "Unofficial mission, no government backing. And if we fail, you can disavow us. And if we succeed, maybe the Council will realize humanity doesn't abandon our own." "And if you start a war?" Price asked. "Then at least we'll know where we stand," Daniel replied. Dr. Kane spoke up unexpectedly. "Madam President, I'd like permission to release my findings about the marking ceremony to the galactic news networks." "That could embarrass the Krullians," Price said. "They're executing a human for interfering in a practice that half their own empire considers illegal." King replied, "Maybe they deserve some embarrassment." Price looked around the room, seeing the conflict in every face. And these were good people, smart people, and they all knew the stakes. But they also all knew what John Morrison represented. General Lane. How long would it take to get the Defiant in position? Price asked. Captain Walsh could be at Zenith Prime in 72 hours. Lane replied, "And how long for Mr. Carter to organize his volunteers?" Price continued, "I have a ship ready to launch in 6 hours. Daniel said. Price closed her eyes for a long moment, and when she opened them, her decision was made. "Mr. Carter, I cannot and will not authorize your mission, and if you launch, Earth forces are ordered to stop you." Daniel's face fell, but Price continued, "However, I'm also ordering General Lane to position the Defiant near Zenith Prime for training exercises. And what Captain Walsh decides to do if he witnesses a civilian ship in distress is entirely his discretion as a ship commander." Understanding dawned in Daniel's eyes. And Lane's too, and it was a thin fiction. Barely plausible deniability, but it was something. "Dr. Kane, you have permission to publish your research through academic channels," Price added. "What the media does with that information is beyond my control." "Yes, Madam President," Kane said with a slight smile. "This conversation is classified," Price said, looking at everyone in the room, "and officially, the United Earth government's position is that we respect the Council's decision and will not interfere." "Understood, Madam President," came the chorus of replies. Daniel Carter stood at attention and saluted. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet," Price said. "You could still die out there. Better to die trying than live knowing I didn't," Daniel replied after they left. Price sat alone in the Situation Room, staring at the image of John Morrison that someone had pulled up on the screen, and he looked calm, confident, like a man at peace with his choices, she picked up her phone and called her chief speechwriter. "I need to address the nation in 2 hours. And I need to explain why we're not starting a war over this. What's the message?" The speechwriter asked. "That we trust in justice. That we believe in the Galactic Council's wisdom. And that we will continue to work through proper channels," Price said. And even as she spoke the words, she knew they were a lie. The message was actually quite different. Humanity was done being pushed around, done sacrificing its values for political convenience. And if the galaxy wanted to know what humans were really made of, they were about to find out. She just hoped John Morrison would survive long enough to see it. And she hoped that Daniel Carter and Captain Walsh knew what they were risking. And most of all, she hoped that she had made the right choice, because if this went wrong, if it sparked a war that humanity couldn't win, then John Morrison's death wouldn't be the only blood on her hands. The protesters outside chanted louder, their voices carrying even through the thick walls of the White House. And Price listened to them and thought about democracy, about how the people had spoken and demanded action, and how she had just set in motion a chain of events that could save one man or doom them. All history would judge her choice. But for now, all she could do was wait and pray that courage would be enough. The execution chamber on Zenith Prime was designed for spectacle. A circular room with transparent walls that allowed witnesses to watch from all sides, and cameras positioned at every angle broadcast the event across the galaxy as a demonstration of council authority. John Morrison walked into the chamber with his head high, refusing to show fear even though his heart raced and his hands trembled slightly. And he wore simple gray clothing, the standard uniform for the condemned, which somehow made the moment more real than the chains had. Ambassador Lisa Martinez stood in the witness gallery, her face a mask of professional composure that barely hid the grief underneath, and beside her, Counselor Venkstar watched with satisfaction that made her want to scream. "Any final words?" High Arbiter Zundra asked from her position on the platform above the chamber. John looked up at the cameras, knowing his words would reach Earth, would reach his brother Daniel and everyone he had ever known. And he spoke clearly and without regret. "I hope the galaxy remembers that protecting children should never be a crime. And I hope humanity never loses the instinct to help those who suffer." Vexstar hissed something in his native language that the translators didn't bother rendering. And Zondra nodded to the technicians. The molecular disintegration platform activated. A circle of light that began to glow beneath John's feet, and he could feel the energy building. A tingling sensation that would soon tear apart every atom of his body. Then the alarms started blaring red. Lights flashed throughout the station as proximity warnings screamed. And on the external monitors, a ship appeared, moving impossibly fast directly toward Zenith Prime. And it was broadcasting on all frequencies. A simple message that repeated over and over. "Release John Morrison." "Daniel," John whispered, recognizing the voice even before the identity scan confirmed it was his brother's ship station. Defense systems activated immediately, targeting the intruder with weapons designed to destroy small asteroids. And energy beams lanced out. The Daniel ship dodged with skill that spoke of military training, weaving through the defensive fire with desperate precision. "He's insane," Vexstar said. "He'll be destroyed in seconds." But Daniel kept coming, and his ship's shields flared bright as hits connected, and chunks of armor tore away. But still, he advanced in the execution chamber. The disintegration sequence had paused automatically when the alarms activated, and John pressed his hands against the energy field that kept him contained. Watching his brother's ship on the monitors, with a mixture of horror and pride, Liza Martinez was already moving, pulling out her communicator and sending urgent messages to Earth forces, though she knew they were too far away to help, and she knew what Daniel was attempting was suicide. But she couldn't help but admire the audacity Captain Gregory Walsh stood on the bridge of the EDF Defiant, watching the situation unfold from a position just outside council space, technically in compliance with orders not to enter the restricted zone. And his crew watched him with expectant faces, waiting for a command they all hoped would come. "Sir, that civilian ship is taking heavy damage," his tactical officer reported. "Shields at 30% and failing." Walsh's hands gripped the command chair, and every instinct told him to act, to protect a fellow human. But his orders were crystal clear. Observe only. Do not engage, and he thought about his career, about his duty, about the consequences of disobedience. Then he thought about what John Morrison had done, and why he was about to die, and he made his choice. Weapons. "I want a targeting solution on those station defenses and engineering. Prepare for emergency jump into council space." "Sir, that's a direct violation of council law," his executive officer said, though there was hope in her voice. "Then they can add me to the execution list." Walsh replied, "Helm, take us in." The Defiant jumped, crossing the boundary into council space in violation of every treaty Earth had signed, and her weapons powered up. Targeting systems locking onto Zenith Prime's defensive platforms. Daniel's ship was burning now, trailing atmosphere and debris, but still moving forward with determination that bordered on madness. And he was close. So close to the station that collisions seemed inevitable on Zenith Prime. Chaos erupted as the council representatives scrambled to understand what was happening. And Zondra was shouting orders, trying to regain control, while Vextar demanded that the execution continue despite the emergency. The Defiant's weapons fired, precise bursts that disabled 3 defensive platforms before the station could react, and suddenly, Daniel's path cleared, and his ship accelerated straight toward the execution chamber's external wall. "He's going to ram us," someone screamed in the control room. Lisa Martinez grabbed John's guard, a Zenere warrior who had shown kindness before, and she shouted over the alarm. "Get him out of there now." The guard hesitated for only a second before unlocking the containment field, and John stumbled free just as Daniel's ship hit the station. The impact was devastating, and crystal and steel shattered as the civilian vessel tore through the outer hull. An emergency bulkhead slammed down, sealing off sections to prevent total decompression. But the execution chamber was exposed to space. John felt himself being pulled toward the breach, the station's atmosphere rushing out into the void, and the guard grabbed him, using his forearms to anchor them both to a support column, while debris and equipment flew past them into space. Then John saw Daniel, or what remained of his ship, embedded in the station wall. And the vessel was a wreck, its fusion core critical. But the transport beam activated one last time. The beam locked onto John, and he felt the familiar tingle of molecular transportation. And the last thing he saw before dissolving was Lisa Martinez's face. Hope and terror mixed in equal measure. He materialized in the Defiant's transport bay. Gasping for air, he hadn't realized he was missing, and medical personnel rushed forward, but John pushed them away. "My brother. Get my brother." "We're trying," Captain Walsh said, entering the bay. "But his ship's systems are fried." "Try harder," John demanded. The Defiant scanners swept the wreckage, searching for life signs and for long seconds that felt like hours. There was nothing, and then they found it. A faint signal. A stasis pod that had activated automatically when the ship was destroyed. "Got him," the transport chief said. Locking on now, Daniel Carter materialized on the pad, unconscious inside an emergency stasis field that had saved his life by slowing his metabolism to almost nothing. And he was injured badly, burns and fractures visible even through the stasis glow. But alive. "Get him to medical," Walsh ordered, and then to John. "You too. Let them check you over." "The station," John said. "You fired on council property. Had a weapons malfunction. Walsh said with a straight face. Completely accidental. Happened right when I was trying to protect a civilian vessel in distress. Which is my duty as a ship commander. John almost laughed at the absurdity of the lie. But then the reality hit him. They had actually done it. They had rescued him. And the implications were staggering. The council will never accept that explanation. John said, probably not. Walsh agreed. But they'll have to prove it was intentional. And my logs will show a very convincing equipment failure. Alarms blared on the Defiant now as council ships began to close in. Responding to the incident, and Walsh moved back to the bridge. Calling over his shoulder, better strap in. This might get rough. The Defiant's engines powered up to full. And she turned away from Zenith Prime, accelerating hard toward the edge of council space. And pursuit ships followed, their weapons charging, and demands for surrender flooded the communication channels. Walsh ignored them all, focused on getting his ship and its precious cargo back to Earth space where the council couldn't easily follow. And his crew worked with practiced efficiency, rerouting power, maximizing speed, doing everything they could to buy seconds that might mean the difference between escape and capture in medical bay. John sat beside his brother's stasis pod, watching the medical scanners work. And the doctor said Daniel would survive, but needed extensive treatment. And John put his hand on the pod's surface. Feeling the cold glass. You idiot, he whispered. You wonderful, brave idiot. Lisa Martinez's voice came through on the Defiant's communication system. Transmitted from Zenith Prime. Captain Walsh. The council has issued an ultimatum. Return John Morrison within 24 hours or face permanent expulsion from council membership and economic sanctions. Acknowledged, Walsh replied. Transmitting our response now. The response was simple. No back on Zenith Prime. In an emergency council session, Zundra tried to restore order as representatives shouted over each other. And some demanded war against Earth. Others called for restraint. And a few quietly wondered if maybe humanity had a point Vexstar stood before them all. His face twisted with rage. This is an act of war. And Earth must face consequences, and they cannot be allowed to violate our laws and escape unpunished. But even as he spoke, something was changing, and news had begun to spread across the galaxy. Not just about the rescue, but about why John Morrison had been sentenced in the first place. And Dr. Susan Kane's research was being broadcast on every major news network, showing that the Krellian marking ceremony was banned in half the Empire itself. Public opinion was shifting, slowly but noticeably, and species that had stayed quiet before began to speak up. And the first crack in the Council's united front came from an unexpected source. A junior Krellian diplomat named Dalanex, who had watched the execution attempt with growing horror. And she belonged to the reformist faction, the ones who had banned the marking ceremony in their territories. And what she had witnessed finally pushed her past the breaking point. She contacted Ambassador Elisa Martinez through encrypted channels, requesting a secret meeting on a neutral mining station far from council oversight. And when Lisa arrived with 2 security officers, she found Dalanex waiting with data files that would change everything. Councillor Vextar lied, Dalanex said without preamble, her translator rendering her hissing speech into clear English. And the council vote was not legitimate. Lisa's heart raced as she downloaded the files, scanning through communications that showed bribes, threats, and political manipulation. And Vextar had spent months building support for harsh punishment against any human who crossed Krellian interests, using John's case as the perfect opportunity. Why are you telling me this? Lisa asked, because what happened to John Morrison was not justice, it was revenge. Dalanex replied. And Vextar used your diplomat's honest mistake to humiliate humanity and strengthen his own political position back home. The other council members. Lisa began, Some were bribed with trade concessions, Dalanex explained. Others were blackmailed with information Vextar had gathered about their own violations. And a few genuinely believed in the sentence. But the vote was corrupted from the start. Lisa looked at the evidence, her mind already racing through the implications. If this gets out, it could destabilize the entire council. Good, Dalanex said simply. Maybe it should be destabilized. And maybe we need to remember what the council was supposed to be. A place of justice. Not politics, back on Earth. John Morrison had been recovering in a secure medical facility, and his injuries from the brief exposure to space were minor. But the emotional toll of the whole ordeal was harder to measure, and he spent hours with counselors and with his brother Daniel, who was healing slowly from his own wounds. Captain Gregory Walsh faced a military tribunal for violating council space, though everyone knew it was a formality, and President Amanda Price had already made clear that she would pardon him regardless of the verdict. And public support for Walsh was overwhelming, with protests demanding he receive a medal rather than punishment. Dr. Susan Kane's research about the marking ceremony had gone viral across the galaxy, spreading through social networks faster than the council could suppress it. And species after species began sharing their own stories about council decisions that favored powerful members over justice. Varelian merchants shared testimony about how council trade courts had ruled against her people consistently to benefit Krellian economic interests. And a Zentari military officer released documents showing weapons deals that violated council neutrality pacts. And a dozen other species came forward with evidence of corruption and bias. The galaxy was waking up to uncomfortable truths, and the council's image as an impartial arbiter of galactic law was crumbling when Lisa Martinez presented Dalanex as evidence to the full council in our emergency session. The chamber erupted in chaos, and representatives shouted accusations at each other while Vextar sat frozen, his political career disintegrating before his eyes. These accusations are fabricated, Vextar finally managed to say, but his voice lacked conviction. The communications are verified, Lisa replied calmly. We have cryptographic proof of authenticity. And 16 different council members received bribes or threats from you, personally. High Arbiter Zundra looked older suddenly, the weight of her position finally showing in her posture. If these allegations are true, they represent the gravest violation of council integrity in our history. They are true, Dalanex said, standing from her seat in the gallery, and I have more evidence if needed, including recordings of Vextar planning the entire operation. The chamber went silent as Dalanex stepped forward, and her presence as a Krellian speaking against another Krellian gave the accusations weight that even skeptics couldn't dismiss. And Vextar's face twisted with betrayal and rage. You are a traitor to our people, Vextar hissed at Dalanex. No, she replied. I am loyal to what our people should be, not what you have made us into. The session adjourned in chaos, and within hours, the council announced a full investigation into the Morrison case and related allegations. And Vextar was placed on administrative leave pending the inquiry. And 3 other council members quietly resigned before they could be formally accused on Earth. President Price addressed the planet from the Oval Office, and her speech was broadcast, not just to humans, but across the galaxy through every available channel. We did not seek this conflict, she said. But when faced with the choice between accepting injustice and standing for what we believe is right, we chose to stand, and we will always choose to stand. Public reaction was mixed, and some praised humanity's courage, while others warned of the dangers of defying galactic authority. But the conversation had shifted from whether Earth was wrong to whether the council itself was corrupt. John Morrison watched the speech from his hospital room, and Daniel sat beside him, his arms still in a regenerative cast, and they didn't speak. Just watched as their personal ordeal became something larger than either of them had imagined. "Did you know this would happen?" Daniel asked finally. "No," John admitted. "I just knew I couldn't watch a child suffer and do nothing. And now the whole galaxy is talking about justice and corruption," Daniel said with a slight smile. "Sometimes small actions have big consequences." John replied the Arcane appeared on the news next, interviewed by a prominent galactic journalist, and she explained the cultural context of the marking ceremony, how it represented old traditions that many Krellians wanted to abandon, and how John's intervention had inadvertently become a catalyst for internal Krellian reform movements. The reformists have gained significant political power in the wake of this incident, Kane explained. And there's a real possibility that the marking ceremony will be banned empire-wide within the year. Back at Zenith Prime, an unexpected visitor arrived to see Lisa Martinez, the Zentari ambassador who had stayed silent throughout the trial. And he was an old diplomat with decades of experience. And he carried a message from several other species. "We have been watching humanity carefully since your arrival," he said. "And we have seen courage, stubbornness, and idealism that many of us had forgotten. And we want to help." "Help how?" Lisa asked carefully. "There are 17 species preparing to leave the Council unless reforms are made," the ambassador explained. "And we stayed because we hoped it would improve. But this incident has shown us that hope alone is not enough. And we need to act." "You would leave the Council over this?" Lisa said. Surprised. "Not just over this," he corrected. "Over decades of corruption that this incident finally exposed, and humanity's refusal to accept injustice, gave us the courage to speak up about our own grievances." Lisa felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. And Earth hadn't just saved John Morrison. They had inadvertently sparked a galactic reform movement. And the implications were staggering. Over the next week, the investigation expanded, and more evidence emerged of Council corruption, trade deals that favored certain species, military aid given to aggressive powers, while peaceful ones were ignored, and judicial decisions influenced by politics rather than law. Public protests erupted on Council worlds, with citizens demanding accountability. And the pressure grew until High Arbiter Zundra announced sweeping reforms, including external oversight of Council decisions, term limits for representatives, and transparent voting procedures. Vexter was formally charged with corruption and abuse of power, and he became the first sitting Council member ever to face criminal prosecution. And the Krellian Empire split between traditionalists who supported him and reformists who demanded his removal. Dalnex emerged as a leader of the reform movement within Krellian space, and her courage in speaking out made her a symbol of change. And she worked with Lisa Martinez to build coalitions across species lines. John Morrison received thousands of messages from across the galaxy, from beings he would never meet, telling him that his stand had inspired them. And parents of all species wrote to thank him for caring about children. Even those from cultures he didn't understand. A Varelian mother sent a message that John read over and over. "You reminded us that compassion transcends culture. And my children are safer because you were brave." Captain Walsh's tribunal ended with a formal reprimand and a quiet promotion. And everyone understood the message. Earth rewarded those who stood for its values. Consequences be damned. President Price met with the coalition of reform-minded species in a virtual summit, and they discussed forming a new framework for galactic cooperation, one built on genuine equality rather than political power. "Humanity is new to the galactic stage," the Zentari ambassador said during the summit. "But you have already taught us an old lesson that we had forgotten. That principle matters more than expedience." "We're just doing what seems right," Price replied. "That is exactly the point," the ambassador said with what might have been a smile. "And when doing what seems right becomes revolutionary." 6 months after the rescue, John Morrison stood in the rebuilt council chamber on Zenith Prime. And the room looked different now, with seats rearranged to eliminate the hierarchical tiers that had given powerful species dominance over smaller ones. And the transparent walls had been replaced with solid ones after repairs. But someone had installed windows that showed the stars. A reminder of what they were all part of. The council itself was different too. And 12 members had been removed for corruption, including Vextar, who now awaited trial in a Krellian reformist court. And new representatives had taken their places, chosen under revised rules that emphasized integrity over political influence. High Arbiter Zindra had resigned voluntarily, admitting that she had failed to prevent the corruption that had poisoned council proceedings. And in her place sat a coalition of 3 arbiters from different species, a system designed to prevent any single individual from wielding too much power. John wore formal diplomatic attire, the same kind Ambassador Lisa Martinez wore beside him, and he was nervous despite the friendly faces he could see scattered through the chamber. And President Amanda Price had come personally from Earth. A sign of how important this moment was considered, the new head arbiter, a Zenari elder named Krovel, called the session to order, and his voice carried authority tempered with humility. "We gathered today to address the case of John Morrison of Earth," Krovel said. "And 6 months ago, this council sentenced him to death for actions we now recognize were born of compassion rather than malice." The chamber was silent, and every species representative listened carefully, knowing that this moment would define the new council's character. The investigation has concluded that the original verdict was influenced by corruption and political manipulation, Krovel continued, and therefore, the council officially vacates the death sentence and extends our apologies to Mr. Morrison and to the people of Earth. Applause broke out, though not from everyone, and some representatives still harbored resentment about how dramatically things had changed. But the majority supported the decision. Delank stood from her seat, now the official Krellian representative after winning a reformist election. "The Krellian reform government wishes to add our own apology. And what was done to John Morrison violated not only galactic law, but our own principles. And the marking ceremony has been banned empire-wide as of last month." More applause followed, and John felt Daniel squeeze his shoulder from where he stood behind him. And his brother had recovered from his injuries, though he walked with a slight limp now. And the doctors said it would fade with time. President Price was invited to speak, and she approached the central podium with the confidence of a leader who had gambled everything and won. "The council's apology is accepted," she said. "But what matters more than words is action. And we have seen action, reforms implemented, corrupt officials removed, and a genuine commitment to justice over politics." She paused, looking around the chamber. Earth joins the Reformed Council not as a junior member seeking approval, but as an equal partner, committed to the principles of fairness and compassion that should guide all civilized species. Krovel nodded. "The Council recognizes Earth's full membership status, with all rights and responsibilities that entails. And we also propose a new position, Human Rights Observer, whose duty will be to ensure that no case like Mr. Morrison's ever occurs again." The vote was called, and it passed with only 3 abstentions. And the reform-minded coalition that had formed in the wake of the scandal now commanded a clear majority. "John Morrison," Krovel said, "the council offers you this position. If you will accept it." John had known this was coming, and Lisa had warned him about it. But hearing it officially still made his heart race, and he stepped forward, aware that countless beings across the galaxy were watching this moment. "I accept," he said simply, "on the condition that this position has real authority to investigate and report on rights violations without political interference." "Agreed," Krovel replied. "The Human Rights Observer will report directly to the arbiters and will have access to all council proceedings." It was more than John had expected. And Lisa gave him a small smile that said she had been working behind the scenes to ensure those terms. And he made a mental note to thank her properly later. The session moved to other business. But first came an unexpected moment. A young Krellian approached the speaker's platform, barely old enough to be an adult by their species standards, and they carried visible scars from the marking ceremony, burns that had been inflicted before the ban. "My name is Kelvar," the young Krellian said, their voice trembling slightly, "and I am the child that John Morrison tried to save." The chamber went absolutely silent, and John felt his breath catch, and he had never learned the child's name. I'd never known what became of them after that day. I could not understand then why a strange alien interfered in my ceremony. Kelvar continued, "But I understand now, and you saw a child in pain and acted to stop it. And that should never have been a crime." Kelvar approached John directly, and the young Krellian extended a clawed hand in the human gesture of greeting that they had clearly practiced. "Thank you for caring enough to try, and because of you, no other Krellian child will have to bear these scars." John shook Kelvar's hand gently, finding his voice with difficulty. "You were brave that day. I'm sorry I couldn't explain what I was doing. You changed my world," Kelvar said simply. "And that is explanation enough." The emotional moment broke something in the chamber's formal atmosphere, and representatives began approaching John and the Earth delegation, offering congratulations and expressing support. And the political maneuvering that would have dominated such a session before was replaced by something more genuine. Daniel Carter stood to the side, watching his brother interact with alien diplomats, and he caught Captain Gregory Walsh's eye. And the captain had come as part of Earth's delegation, and they shared a knowing look that said they understood what their actions had cost and what they had won. "Worth it," Daniel said quietly. "Definitely." Walsh agreed. Dr. Susan Kane was there too, presenting to council anthropologists about cultural sensitivity training that would be mandatory for all diplomatic staff. And her research had become the foundation for new protocols, designed to prevent misunderstandings like John's from escalating to crisis. President Price found John during a break, and they stepped out onto a balcony that overlooked the station's central habitat ring, and through the windows, they could see gardens where a dozen different species plants grew together in carefully maintained harmony. "How does it feel?" Price asked. "To be the most famous human in the galaxy." "Overwhelming," John admitted. "And I just wanted to help a child." "You did help," Price said. "And not just that one child, but millions who will benefit from the reforms your case inspired." "I can't take credit for that," John protested. "And Dalinex provided the evidence. You made the political decisions. Lisa built the coalitions, and none of it would have happened if you had looked away when you saw suffering," Price replied. "And moral courage is the foundation everything else is built on." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, and then Price added, "The job won't be easy, and you'll make enemies, and some species will resent human influence in council affairs." "I know," John said, "but you'll also save lives," Price continued. "And you'll prevent injustices, and you'll remind everyone why we formed this council in the first place. To work together," John said. "To be better than we are alone," Price corrected. The session resumed, and the council moved to formally establish the reforms that had been proposed. And term limits for representatives passed unanimously. And external oversight committees were created with representatives from species not on the council. Ensuring fresh perspectives and transparent voting procedures were implemented, making it impossible to hide corruption behind closed doors. Each reform was a direct response to the failures that had led to John's sentence, and each one made the council stronger and more legitimate as the session neared its end. Crowell made one final announcement. "The council recognizes that we failed John Morrison and, through him, failed our own principles, And we propose that this date be designated as a day of reflection across all member worlds. When we remember that justice requires constant vigilance, the proposal passed without objection, and John felt the weight of it, and his name would be remembered not for the sentence but for what came after. And he wasn't sure he deserved that legacy, but he would try to live up to it. The formal session ended, but the real work was just beginning. And John spent hours meeting with representatives who wanted to discuss rights issues in their territories. And he listened to stories of discrimination, exploitation, and suffering that had gone ignored for too long. A Varelian trade delegate spoke about economic policies that kept their people poor while enriching larger species. And a Zentari medical officer described how military veterans received inferior care compared to council officials. And species after species brought forward problems they had been afraid to raise before. John took notes, asked questions, and promised to investigate. And he realized that his new position was more than ceremonial, and there was real work to be done, real injustices to address.